In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at modeling part of this vintage camera. It's called a Braun Niso Super 8 film camera. A while back, I did a modeling project where I showed how you could model something with subdivision surfaces, or you could use an alternative method with direct polygon modeling where you did not use subdivision surfaces. And this particular object is a good example where approaching the modeling of this object without subdivision surface is actually somewhat advantageous. So if we take a look at this, let's come into wireframe mode, you can see that it's kind of a messy polygon mesh, but it actually works perfectly for subdivision surfaces. We have this situation where when I turn off the subdivision surface, you can see the patched polygon mesh that generates that subdivision surface. But when we take a look at this, we're really just working with a primarily flat surface with some curvature around the perimeter, and then we have a little bit of curvature for some of the detail areas. That's what makes this mechanical model work pretty well as far as direct polygon modeling that circumvents the need for creating a patchwork system in this planar region. So let's go ahead and dive in and see how we can model this using a direct polygon modeling approach. Let's go ahead and start with the start file where I have a template that has the core features in place. I've simply imported this as a plane with a bitmap on it. If we look at this from the left view, the blue line is 0 along the y-axis, and that's going to be where we're going to place at least some of our geometry. And I've got the template sitting behind that. I don't want to be able to select that, so I'm going to come down to the object properties and turn off selectable, come back into the front view, and I've already created a collection here called for projection. We're going to use the knife project tool in order to do this. We're going to be relying on the fact that we have a large planar region that we're going to have these cutouts in. One thing to keep in mind is the fact that polygons don't like to have holes in them. Applications like Blender have to perform sort of tricks to make it look like you've got a hole in a polygon. So let's go ahead and approach it with that sort of understanding in the back of your mind. I have the model collection here. That's what I'm going to activate, and we're going to press Shift and A. We'll add a simple plane. I want it to be aligned to the view, and let's just make it 4 inches as a starting point. S key scales it, and I'll get right to that outer line. SX, and then I'll scale right like that. This secondary line at the top is basically the demarcation point for the radius of the rounding on this faceplate. Command A, we're going to apply the scale, and let's also do this. N key, we're going to notice here an item that the object has rotation, so let's also remove that. Command A, and we're going to remove the rotation. Let's come over here and pay attention to the rounding of the corners first. So Tab key and select a single corner right there. And we're going to come up to Vertex and then Bevel Vertices and just pull down until you begin seeing movement and come right to those intersection points. But we clearly want rounding to happen. So let's just punch in a value, Tab key. We need to really pay attention to the resolution of our object because we're not going to be relying on subdivision surfaces to give us resolution. So let's keep pumping this value up till we get something that we think is going to be appropriate. I'm going to go up higher to 32, and I think that'll be an appropriate value right there. So click to activate and then come down to the bottom, select that vertex and press Shift R to replicate that. The next thing that we want to do is we want to add a bounding edge. Let me turn off the template temporarily. We want a bounding edge or vertex past the curvature area. If we zoom way in, we can see this angling and the faceting of the angles here. This angle comes right up to this very long straight area, and we don't want surface normal shading to pass this area. So we have to add a bounding vertex on either side of the curvature. So I'm going to press the K key, click here, and then click right there, and hit return. We don't need the edge, so press the 2 key to switch into edge mode, select that edge, bring up the context menu, and then let's do dissolve edge, but we do not want to have the dissolve vertex option enabled. We want those 2 vertices as bounding edges to be there. So let's come down to the bottom and do the same thing here. K key, click here, click there, return, 2 key, select just that edge, do a dissolve edges, and it will remember the last option change you had. And there we go. So now the basic perimeter is set. So let's come in now. Let's turn back on our template so we can see that. We need to adjust this side. It's overshot just a little bit. So press the G key, X, and bring that into alignment with the template. Okay, so that's good. Now, we need to start adding details for these cutout areas. Buttons actually sit over these areas, but they are cutouts still. And we need to remember that ngons, this is a big ngon. This is one big ngon. We need to dice it up into smaller segments because remember, if you try and create a hole in an ngon via the knife project or a Boolean operation, Blender is automatically going to create a connection to the outside perimeter, and it would be better if we controlled how that connection is. But we first need to move this geometry into position. So if we look at this in the left view, remember I said that the template is offset a little bit. Press the Tab key to leave edit mode, period key returns the pivot point to the active element, and then when we move it, then the pivot moves with the object. But let's move it numerically along the Y direction, left to right, looking left, and let's return that to a 0 point. So we're not modeling right on the template. Okay, come back into the front. Tab key comes into edit mode, and let's switch over into edge mode because we're going to extrude this now. But we don't need to extrude this end, just the way that the faceplate is structured. So hold the Shift key and deselect that. And now press the E key to extrude, but we only want to go along the Y-axis. So press Y, pull it out about that far. That's really only about as far as we need to go. Let's come to the front now and produce the rounding that we can see just going around the perimeter. So if we double click, select that outward perimeter, we're going to use the bevel tool. The bevel tool is going to feature really prominently in this tutorial. It's such a wonderful tool for hard body modeling. Let's switch over from select box to active tool so that we can directly select elements to operate on them with whatever the current tool is. And we want to change the segments for the bevel tool to 2 with a shape of 1, and that will maintain the existing geometry, but it'll put boundary loops on either side of the existing edge. Click, hold, and drag, and then just let's pull out a little bit farther than that reference line, something about like that. This reference line is what I'm looking at. So when we rotate the view, you can see that what this has done is it's produced planar loops of polygons on either side of this existing edge. So let's come in now. Let's turn off this template temporarily. Double click this edge, same loop that we were just operating on. Let's zoom down. We're still in the bevel tool. Let's switch over now. Let's do 5 segments with the default round shape of 0.5. Click, hold, and drag, and we'll pull this up. And go to about right there. Now this is important because the remnants of the segments 2 shape 1 inset are these boundaries here and here, which are planar to the large ngon and planar to this area over here. Those are very critical for controlling the shading on this. So let's actually increase the resolution because we're considering the resolution of this because we're modeling the direct polygons that we're going to be rendering with. So let's increase this to maybe a value of 10. And I think that's going to work pretty well. Let's come into the front. So let's just, I want to make sure this is very clear. This loop here is planar to this front polygon, and that controls the shading. That's very important to understand. Let's come back into the front view. Let's turn back on the template. I need to leave polygon edit mode. Let's turn the template back on. And now let's add these regions, which are going to be cut out using the knife project tool. Shift A, and we're going to create a circle. We want it to be oriented to the view. Let's make it quite a bit smaller, 1 inch. That's pretty big too, 1/2 an inch. Now, we need to look at this pretty close. You can see that it's pretty chunky, and we want to increase the resolution. So we could go to 64. Let's do this. Let's go to 82. Let's just go a little bit larger than that. We just make sure that we have a point at the top and the bottom, and I think that will work pretty well. So we'll move this up. We just sort of eyeball it. S key scales it down. Just make adjustments. It doesn't need to be 100% accurate. Pretty close, about like that. Okay. Shift and D duplicates it along the Z axis, but you notice when I tap the Z key, it doesn't move. That's because it's rotated and it's initially trying to move it along the local Z axis. So tap Z a second time, and then it will move it along the global Z direction. And then I'm going to do a Shift and D, pull out a duplicate over here. It's slightly different. So we'll just zoom in. G key, get that about to the center. S key, scale that out. Press Shift and S, do cursor to selected. Let's pull out a little bit. We're going to create geometry for this. Shift A, we'll do a plane. Again, let's come to View, and then let's set it to 1 inch. Probably a little bit too big, but we'll just scale it down with the S key. Then we'll move that down about like that. Okay, S key scales it to about the size of the box. S, X, and about like that. Okay, let's do the same thing, except we'll just duplicate this. Shift D, Z, but again, we have to tap Z a second time because there's rotation on it. And we'll bring that right to the top. S, X, and there we go. So that's pretty close. Now let's return our attention to this. So this is an inset area for an indicator. So let's come in and work on the dial. The dial is 270 degrees of cutout. Press the Tab key. Come into vertex mode where you can see those vertices. Press the F key to fill that. Now, this is an interesting thing to understand, is that we're going to be using all of these projection pieces of geometry to cut out into the main faceplate. But we only need perimeter vertices and edges. We don't want anything internal. So let's keep that in the back of our mind. I key to inset right to about there. Press the X key to delete the inner polygon face. So if I press the A key, we can see all of that. But we don't need all of these internal edges. So we're going to come back to that. We want to remove a 90-degree segment. Come back over to the Move tool or the Selection tool. I'm in Active Tool, so I want to switch to Select Box. Let's carefully marquee around that segment right there. X key, delete those faces. Now, in Edge mode, I'm going to double-click around the edge, hold the Shift key. So we've got the whole parameter selected. And in Select, we're going to do Invert, bring up the context menu, and then Dissolve Edges. But you do not want to have the Dissolve Vertices option on. We want to have all of those still available. We have a single ngon here. That's what we need for the Knife Project tool. Okay, so we've got all of those components, and they're sitting right now. I'm going to press the Tab key, leave edit mode. These are all sitting back on the same plane as the template. So let's move all of those out sort of front. Let's turn off the template. In fact, I'm just going to call this face plate. And I've got 2 earlier versions. I'm going to delete one of those. So we've got face plate. Tab key comes into edit mode, and let's add some loops. These will become more apparent as we add them. So we have The loop cut we could use, but it's limited. It will only detect certain conditions where the loop can be applied, and we don't want that. We want something that goes across all the geometry. So we're going to use the knife tool, K key, come right about to the top, click, press the Z key, and come down to the bottom. But you got to remember to press C so that it will knife all the way through the geometry, not just visible geometry. Hit return. Okay, we're going to come back to that. We need to do it one more time. K key, click, Z, and then C, and click, and return. Okay, I'm going to do it one more time. K, X, C, click, and return. So we've still got these ngons, but that's going to give us some controllability for putting holes into the geometry. So let's come into edge mode. We need to move these into place relative to these cutouts. Double click to select this loop. Let's zoom in a little bit. Press the G key and then X, but we want to snap it. So we're going to use a new function in 4.0. Press the B key, click the first point, which is the snapping location on the loop, move it over until we get to that top vertex point on the circular area, and release, and it snaps. Super useful. Okay, so let's do the same thing over here. Double click to select that loop, GX, press the B key, click here, and then come over and click the center, and that loop is going to affect all of these 3 cutout objects. So we've gotten the geometry prepared for doing the knife project. So I'm going to click to deselect everything. We want to remain in polygon edit mode. Go ahead and select these 5 objects. Because we're still in edit mode, we come over to mesh and then do a knife project, and it will just slice that up. Let's go ahead and turn off for projection all of those items off, and there they are, cut out. Let's come over in face mode and let's extrude these because these are going to be inset. E key and just extrude those. It does along the normals. Click and then the X key to delete just the faces. So when we come in and turn this into shading mode, we can see that right there. Okay, so let's do the next one down here. Select these 2 polygons. E key, we're going to pull that in just about that far, and then X key to delete just the faces. Those are polygons, believe it or not, and all of these are just large ngons, and we don't need to worry about dicing this up for subdivision surfaces. Let's come up here and do the next one up here. Front view, let's zoom down. Press the I key to do this inset. Rotate around, I'll just grab that and move that in. Then E key to extrude one time, and then X key to remove those faces. There we go. And then let's come over here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to merge these right here to make these a single ngon. Bring up the context menu and do a dissolve faces, and those get merged into a single ngon. In fact, we can do the same thing here and here. Just press Shift R and it will merge those into a single ngon. Let's come in here and press the E key to extrude that in about that far. And then we'll just leave that down there. That one we want to leave. So let's return our attention back at the top over on the left side. Come into edge mode, which is the 2 key. Double click on the edge here and then hold the Shift key in this edge. Come back to our friend the Bevel tool in its 2-1 configuration. This little widget appears when the drag method is in select box. So you can do that or be in active tool mode, which I kind of like because you can just click on a selected element and pull out about that far. Let's come down to the bottom. Click, hold the Shift key, click that, and then press Shift R to repeat that command. Let's do it one more time. In this case, we're going to switch over to 6.0 0.5, the default rounding parameter, and just do that. There we go. And then up here, we do the same thing. Double click, Shift R. So let's stop and pull back, take a look at it. I'll press Tab to leave edit mode, bring up the context menu with the object selected and do Shade Auto Smooth. And there we go. So we've got the two holes cut out. Let's come back into edit mode. Let's focus on this area, because this has just one part of it that's a little bit tricky. We want to produce a bevel around the perimeter of this like we've done with those two circular holes. I'm going to double click the perimeter. In fact, what I'm going to do to make sure the focus stays here, because this is going to be hard to focus on, come to the cursor, click kind of in that corner region, come over to view, and then do lock to 3D cursor so I can pivot around the 3D cursor. That will just keep that in position. Come back to our friend the bevel tool, set it back to the 2:1 configuration. In fact, let's come over here and make this a little bit more visible. There we go. Click, hold, and drag, and pull it out. But look at the corners. The algorithm is doing something a little bit wonky with the corner, and it's going to have an impact when we try and bevel it. So let's double click this corner loop. Let's switch this back over to maybe like a 5.5 configuration. Let's come into the front, and when we try and bevel it, you see how it's down here, it's what I like, but it's now overshooting. And so the algorithm is producing something that's a little bit wonky. So we're going to undo this, and we're going to back up, and I'm going to approach this a little bit different. Let's come back into shaded, make sure we're in face mode. I will delete this bottom polygon because we can regenerate that. Press the X key to delete faces. There we go. Now double click to select this inner boundary loop, and we're going to come over to the extrude along normals variation. In fact, let's look at this in the front view. Click, hold, and drag, and we're going to pull in just about that far. So this will also produce that boundary loop that we need, the planar boundary loop. But it is doing something of its own accord that's slightly weird here. So let's come down to the options, and it does have something to correct that. Click offset even, it'll fix that. So that's great. Now we can just come back into edge mode, double click this loop, this boundary loop. I'm going to come back into wireframe. It's easier to see. We're going to switch back to our friend the bevel tool. Make sure you're in the 5.5 configuration. Let's do that. That works so much better. Okay, there we go. Now I am going to come over and produce one loop here, and that will give me a boundary. It's a minor detail, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. Underneath, it's put a row of polygons. It's kind of like an underneath ledge. We don't need that. So let's switch back over into face mode. I just pressed the 3 key, double click, press the X key to delete those faces, and now press the 2 key to go back into edge mode. Double click this open boundary. You can see it is unfilled. Press the F key to fill that with a polygon, and there we go. Let's come down to the bottom. In fact, I'm going to set the cursor right there, and then we'll rotate around the cursor's position. Let's focus on this corner right here. Okay, come back into Move Tool. We want to make sure we're in edge. There we are. So I'll select that edge, come back over to the Bevel tool. I'm pressing just Shift and Space bar. Clicking that, make sure we are in our 2:1 configuration. Click, hold, and drag, and I'll pull up about like that because we're going to produce a rounding around that area. And I think that works pretty well. These are the boundary polygons. Shift R. We'll select both of these. Shift R. This is sort of one of the downsides of using this 3D cursor, is it tends to make it difficult under some circumstances to manipulate the view. So the next thing that we're going to do is just focus back down over here, and switch back over to something like a 5.5 configuration, which is sort of a good default, and pull up like that. In fact, I want a little bit more geometry, so let's make this 9. And I think that works pretty well. But we have the boundary here and the boundary here to prevent shading from going into the flat regions. So there we go. And then we just come up, Shift R, and replicate that around to the other side here and here, Shift R. This design detail has a bit of a large bevel. So let's double click. We'll get one half of it. Hold the Shift key, double click to get the other half. Zoom down over this region. Let's come back into the bevel parameters. We're going to go to a value of 1 because we're going to do a very basic bevel. Click, hold, and drag. Make this one pretty large, about like that. We can always take this loop, press the G key, Y, to extend that out if we need that a little bit thicker. But now we'll double click around this outer boundary, hold the Shift key, double click on that to get both sides. Here again, this is why this bevel tool is such a useful tool. Come back to our 2-1 configuration, click, hold, and drag, produce those, and then double click again. Come back to something like 5.5. This is a very good default, and add a little bit of rounding. And then we're going to do the same thing here. Now in this case, since I've got the tool set, I'm just going to go ahead and bevel that, pull out a little bit like that. And then we'll just use the loop cut tool to manually and quickly add those since the tool was already configured. And in fact here, I could double click this. Let's switch back over so this is a little bit easier to see. There we go. Then you could come down and use the edge slide function, click, hold, and drag, and slide that a little bit closer. Very minor detail. I wouldn't worry too much about that, but that looks pretty nice. Let's come over and look at this in shaded mode, and there we go. So I think that works really well for that bottom detail. And then we've just got one more at the top, which will also have one extra option to set for that. Let's come back into edit mode. So I just clicked tab. And in this case, I'm not going to worry about adding any corner geometry because this is a really small area. I'm going to go to some degree of detail here because I want to show you a neat feature. Let's come back to the bevel tool, go back to the 2-1 configuration, click, hold, and drag to produce our boundaries, make it moderate like that, and then we'll just switch back over to something like 4.5, add some bevel right there. Now we're going to take a look at this one because let's go into the front view and let's drop out and tab key to leave edit mode, and we'll look at this in shading. I want to bring your attention to the fact that we've got some nebulous shading going on here, but we've got a nice solid angle. So what do we do about that? If we come over to the data object properties and we look at normal, we have a 30-degree, a very standard 30-degree shading, which means if the angles between polygons are less than 30 degrees, it uses surface normal smoothing between the polygons, but if it's outside of that angle, it produces a hard edge. Well, we're in a situation where fiddling with this value may or may not get you the result, and we want a hard boundary to continue up through here. Well, this is where we come in edge mode, double click this edge, and we come up to the edge menu and come down to where it says mark sharp. Watch what happens. It breaks the shading regardless of what the auto smooth function is. So let's do that here. Shift R, you can see that happen. Shift R and Shift R, tab key. Now we've got that angle coming all the way out. So that's a really, really useful function. And then we pull out, and there we go. So we have our faceplace modeled, and we've done it in such a way that we don't have to create complex patchwork of polygons in this planar region to accommodate the subdivision surface algorithm. So in some cases like this, especially for mechanical modeling, a direct polygon approach may be a better way to generate a piece of geometry.